Section 4.3, our objective today is I can deduce information about segments and angles after proving that two triangles are congruent. So yesterday we learned three ways or three postulates that allow us to show that two triangles are congruent to each other. The reason we would want to do that is so that we can say that certain parts of triangles are congruent to each other. So basically, what we want to do is we want to, number one, we want to show or prove that two triangles are congruent. Then, once we show that they are congruent, then we want to show that particular parts of those triangles are congruent. So, for instance, one side is congruent to another side of a triangle, or one angle is congruent to another angle. And the way that we do that is by using the reason that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay? So it's obvious that if the two triangles are congruent, then all their parts are congruent. And so we can use this reason, and you can abbreviate corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay? So let's see how that works. Example. Whoops. Okay, so example number one. Given. Angle 1 is congruent to angle R. Angle 2 is congruent to angle N. And segment MR is congruent to segment MN. I want to prove that segment KR is congruent to segment PN. And I have this picture. Okay, so where this is K, this is R, this is M, this is N, and this is P. And this is angle 1 and angle 2. Okay? So, number one is our given. Angle 1 is congruent to angle R. Okay, so let's mark that in our picture. Angle 1 is congruent to angle R. And angle 2 is congruent to angle N. So this one is congruent to this one. Okay. And we know that because it's given. But in our picture, what do we know about angle 1 and angle 2? What has to be true about angle 1 and angle 2? Well, angle 1 must be congruent to angle 2 by vertical angle theorem. So then I can say angle R is congruent to angle N by substitution. Okay? And I also know from my given that MR is segment MR is congruent to segment MN, because that was given. So here's what I have now. I have this angle congruent to this angle. I have this angle congruent to this angle. And I know that this side is congruent to this side. So I have two angles and the included side of one triangle, and two angles on the included side of the other triangle congruent. So therefore I can say that the triangles are congruent. So I can say that triangle RKM is congruent to triangle NPM. And we concluded that by the angle side angle postulate. Okay? But if the triangles are congruent, then their parts must be congruent. So therefore, the parts that we want are KR and PN. Okay, so those are corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So we can say that segment KR is congruent to segment PN by corresponding parts. Congruent triangles are congruent. Okay? So notice that what we did is we reasoned logically until we got two triangles congruent to each other. And then once we had those triangles congruent, then we could say corresponding parts were congruent. So that's basically the idea here. So first we want to show the triangles congruent, then we want to say that hence their corresponding parts are congruent. So let's try another one. Given ray DF, ray DF bisects angle EDG, and DE is congruent to DG. Segment DE is congruent to segment DG. Prove that angle E is congruent to angle G. And then we're using this picture right here. So let's see what we know. We know that this bisects this angle. Okay? So if it bisects that angle, then we know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So we know this angle is congruent to this one. We also know that DE is congruent, segment DE is congruent to segment DG. So I have a side, an angle of a side and an angle of one triangle congruent to a side and an angle of another triangle. So I either need another side or I need another angle. Well, notice that that both triangles share this side. Whoops. Okay, both triangles share that side. So we have two sides and the included angles, so we can get the triangles congruent. So here's how we reasoned. Number one, we said that ray DF bisects angle EDG. Okay, and that was given. Then from that, we said, okay, well that means angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 by definition of angle bisector. Okay? Then we also know that DE was congruent, or segment DE is congruent to segment DG, and we know that because it's given. And we could have just put this in number 1 because it was all in our given, but this is the way that we reasoned it out. And then we looked at it and we said, oh, we said, well, segment DF is congruent to segment DF by the reflexive property. Okay? Then we said, okay, now we have two sides and the included angle. So therefore, the triangles have to be congruent. So triangle DEF has to be congruent to triangle DGF. Be careful how you name the triangles, because remember you have to name corresponding parts in order. So we said that was by side, angle, side postulate, the two sides and the included angle. And now, since the triangles are congruent, their parts have to be congruent. Therefore, angle E must be congruent to angle G by corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay? Then there's one definition that sometimes you need for proofs, and that's definition of a line perpendicular to a plane. Okay? And we say that a line is perpendicular to a plane if and only if, first of all, they intersect, so they have to intersect, and second, that the line is perpendicular to all lines in the plane through the point of intersection. Okay, so in other words, it's saying if you have some plane X, and we have some line, and we want to say that that's perpendicular, say that point O, then that line has to be perpendicular to every line in that plane that goes through that point. Okay? So we have line AO, we have line BO, we have line CO. And line PO is perpendicular to every one of those lines, and so then it's perpendicular to the plane also. All right, let's do one more proof here. So example 3. So in this one, let's say that our given is that segment AB is congruent to segment CB, and that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. We want to prove that segment BD bisects segment AC. Okay, and here's our picture. Okay, so let's think about this. Okay, if BD bisects AC, then D must be a midpoint. So we have to show somehow that that is a midpoint. Okay? And if that is a midpoint, then I know that AD is congruent to DC. Okay, so I need to prove that. In order to prove that, I need to prove that the two triangles are congruent. So that's kind of the idea of what I'm doing here. Okay, and let's see what I know. I know that segment AB is congruent to segment CB, okay, and that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So I have a side and I have an angle, so I either need another angle or I need another side. And can I get a side of angle 1, another side of angle 1 congruent to another side of angle 2? Yes, we can do that by reflexive property. Okay, so number 1, AB is congruent to segment CD, and angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. You can say all that because it's given. Then we said, well, we could say that BD is congruent to BD, and that is by reflexive property. So now I have this side congruent to this side, this angle congruent to this angle, and that side congruent to itself. So I have an side angle side, and the angle is the included angle between the two sides. So now I can say that triangle BDA is congruent to triangle BDC. And that was by side angle side postulate. Okay? Well then, if those are congruent, then it has to be true that segment AD is congruent to segment DC. And that is because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay? So now I've accomplished this much. So that means that I can say this now. Okay? So now I can say that D is the midpoint of segment AC. And that is by definition of midpoint. Okay? Then that means that BD, segment BD, must bisect segment AC by definition of segment bisector. And we're done, because we've accomplished what we want to accomplish. So again, notice that the steps were to prove two triangles congruent. Once we were able to prove those two congruent, we were able to say certain parts were congruent, and then from there reason logically to get what we wanted.